Today we're going to be taking notes over section 1.1, part 2, continuing from the last section, except today we're talking about intervals on a graph. We'll take a pause from the video for a few moments while you grab two different colored highlighters or two different colored pens. So take a moment and gather those up, and then we'll get started. Before we get going, we want to take some notes over just some terms that we're going to be discussing as we go through the notes today. The first is an x-intercept. You may already know what this is. We'll go ahead and give it a definition. An x-intercept is a point or points where the line crosses the x-axis. So it may have more than one point of x-intercept, or it may only have one. It just depends on the graph that we're looking at. So an interval is a section of the graph between two x values. Now, when we write this interval, we're going to use parentheses. We're going to use a set of parentheses to define what those two numbers are. So you'll have an x and another x, and that means the interval between those two x's. We're going to start this first part looking at positive and negative intervals. So a positive interval is the part or the parts of the graph that are above the x-axis. So they are above the x-axis. So of course, when we think about the negative intervals, again, that is the part or parts of the graph, you knew it, below the x-axis. So you've gathered up a couple of different colored pens, and we're going to use those here, and I'll use a highlighter on my graph so that you can see it. We're going to take a look at several different graphs. Again, you'll notice here I made an asterisk just to make a note where it says we will use parentheses only, and we do that because when we find those x values, the x value, it is on 0. So we can't really say that that x is a positive or a negative. And so we're going to use a set of parentheses because parentheses mean not equal to. So I'm going to define what I'm going to use for positive and what I'm going to use for negative. I'm going to use two different color highlighters. I'll go ahead and use yellow for my positive, and I'll use green for my negative. You can use whatever two colors you have available, and you can define which one you want to be positive and which one you want to be negative. Just kind of try to keep it consistent so it will help you out. So what I'm going to do here on this next part is I'm going to highlight on this next section the parts that are positive and the parts that are negative. So again, I'm going to choose yellow for positive. So I'm looking at the line. You can see here I have a parabola, and this parabola goes all along the graph. Well, remember, positive is where the graph is above the x-axis. So anything that's above the axis. So I'm going to highlight the section of graph that's above the x-axis. And I'm going to highlight in the next color the part that's below the x-axis. And here you can see above and below. And you might even want to go ahead and take a pen that you have and go ahead and mark the points in which it's crossing over from positive to negative. And now that we mark those parts, we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm going to make a note of what those x-intercepts are. So those points in which the graph crosses the x-axis. And I can see I have two of them. I have one at -3 and I have 1 at positive 3. So what I'm going to do is those values are going to help me mark these intervals. Remember, as the graph is going in this direction, it's going to a positive infinity. And as this graph goes in this direction, it's going to a negative infinity. I'll mark the positive intervals. And what you can see is we technically have 2 yellow things that we have marked. We've marked one on the left side and one on the right side. That means I'm going to have 2 separate intervals for the positive sections. I have one that's coming in from negative infinity, and it's going to that x-intercept at negative 3. Then the next one is starting over at positive 3 and going to infinity. How do we join those together? We're going to use something called a union symbol, and that union symbol is going to join those 2 intervals together. Now, you can see we have an interval or a section in which that graph is below the x-axis. So this green part, which is from negative 3 to positive 3, is below the axis. And what I'd like you to pay attention to is another way to look at this is negative infinity to negative 3. This section here is negative 3 to positive 3. And this section here is positive 3 to infinity. So you can see I'm not having any gaps in these numbers. It's going all the way from negative infinity to positive infinity. And that helps us tell that we're not leaving anything out. If that helps you, you can use that as kind of a tool as well. I'm going to go to the second example here, and we'll mark, again, those x-intercepts. So I can see that the graph is crossing the x-intercept at both negative 2 and at positive 2. I'm going to mark and highlight. I picked up green first, so I'll go negative, anything below the x-axis, and positive, anything above. Now remember, I want all the way from negative infinity to positive infinity. So my positive infinity is just this section of that graph. That section is negative 2 to positive 2. Again, I have 2 sections that are below, and I want 2 separate intervals, negative infinity to negative 2 and positive 2 to positive infinity. If you needed to look at this again, you could see that interval goes from negative infinity all the way to negative 2, from negative 2 to positive 2, and positive 2 to infinity. So we're not missing anything in that set of numbers. Let's look at some more detailed graphs, some that are maybe a little bit more complicated than what it was first. And I'm going to use that same strategy. I'm going to mark the x-intercepts. You can see I now have 3 different x-intercepts. I have one at negative 3, I have one at negative 2, and I have one at 1. You should always see those numbers in your intervals when it comes to writing those intervals out. Okay? All right, so let's go ahead and let's look at above the x-axis. Above and above the x-axis. We'll mark below the x-axis. Below and below the x-axis. So with these intervals, I have 2 sections of yellow, and I have 2 sections of green. We'll start with the positive. The positive is this little section here, which is going from -3 to -2. And then I'm joining that with this section, which is basically starting at 1 and going all the way to infinity, because if this graph just continued, this graph would continue to go out that direction. So it's starting at 1, going to infinity. When I look at the negative intervals, this graph, it continues negative infinity. So it's going from -infinity to -3. And it's joining with this section, which goes from -2 to +1. Again, if you wanted to look at all of those sections written out, you would have -infinity to -3. You'd have a little section here from -3 to -2. You'd have a section from -2 to +1. And you'd have a section from +1 to infinity. So there's no gaps in the numbers. I'm going from this to this, this to this, this to this. I'm fluid all the way through. Why don't we take a second and we can pause the video and you can take a look at this section here, mark the x-intercepts, and see if you can find the positive and the negative intervals. So take a pause and we'll come back. All right, you hopefully have a pause, so I'll go through the process really quickly. We have 4 x-intercepts, 1 at -1, 1 at 2, 1 at 3, 1 at 5. We have a positive section going from -infinity to -1. We have another positive section going from 2 to 3. And we have a third positive section going from 5 to infinity. Hopefully you've highlighted those. You have those 3 sections. Those 3 sections are above the x-axis. Coming back to our negative, hopefully you've joined those. You can even see this gap here. So see, you can see this section would have to go between those 2 numbers. And I bet this next section is going to have to go between those 2 numbers. And absolutely you can see that here. The graph is -1 to 2 and 3 to 5. Okay, now we will move down and we will look at a different set of intervals. So in the second section, we are going to be looking at increasing and decreasing intervals. Before we get looking at the actual graphs, we need to do some definitions like we did before. First, let's talk a little bit about slope. You know that we have 2 kinds of slope. First of all, we have positive slope, which runs from going up from the left to the right. So any graph that's going in this direction. And of course, we have a negative slope. Any graph going down from the left to the right. We're not going to be looking at x-intercepts this time. Now we're going to be looking at something called a turning point. So a turning point is an x value. So it's using an x value where the graph slope turns from positive to negative or from negative to positive. So in other words, it's the x value in which that graph is going to switch directions. Okay, intervals. We talked about intervals before, so you're familiar with that. Again, the interval is using a set of parentheses, except now it's going to be a part or parts of the graph with a positive slope And that means that a decreasing interval would be a part or parts of the graph with a negative slope. In these first few pictures, I'm going to show you that turning point. So I can see that this graph goes down, and then it changes direction, and then it goes up. So that point in which it changes direction is right here. That point is on x equals 0. That is our turning point. The point in which the graph turns from negative to positive. I'm going to use my colors again, and I'm going to do positive intervals for yellow. So positive or increasing, okay, increasing for yellow, and decreasing for green. So this is a negative slope or a decreasing interval, and this is a positive slope or an increasing interval. So we're no longer looking at above the axis or below the axis. We're looking at the slope of the line. And you can tell we're doing kind of the same thing. This graph is going from negative infinity until we get to that turning point at 0. At that turning point at 0, it changes. So my increasing interval starts at 0 and goes to infinity. My decreasing interval is coming in from infinity and going to 0. So I'd highly recommend that you mark what that turning point is, and then you label your intervals. Here, I'm going to mark the turning point, the point in which the graph switches. This particular graph is actually increasing. It's going up first, then it hits that turning point, and it goes down. Again, here is the x value, x equals 0. So that turning point is at 0. Our intervals of increase now, increasing is negative infinity to 0. And our decreasing starts at 0 and is on the other side and goes to positive infinity. So we've looked at 2 easy graphs. Let's look at some more complicated ones here. I'm going to mark those turning points of this first graph to start with. So I'm going to mark a turning point of where I believe that graph is going to switch over. So I believe it's switching over here. And then the graph goes up. And then it hits another turning point before the graph goes down. So again, decreasing, the graph is going down. It switches, it hits that turning point. Then the graph goes up, hits that turning point, and the graph goes down. What are those turning points? The turning points are -1 and +1. So I'm not looking at where it's crossing the axis. I'm looking at the points in which it turns from an increasing slope to a decreasing slope. I only have one interval where the graph is increasing. That is increasing from -1 to +1. The graph is decreasing or going down on the other 2 intervals. See here, the graph is going down. Here, the graph is going down again. So the graph is going down the first interval from negative infinity to -1. We're going to group those 2 together. It's going to start back over at 1 and go to positive infinity. Why don't we take a pause in this particular video and you can try the next one. Mark the turning points and then mark the values of increase and decrease. All right, picking back up here, we can see a turning point, and a turning point. I have a couple of different turning points and lots of different sections of this graph. I have a turning point. Hopefully you noticed that was at -1. You notice that we have another turning point at 0 and another turning point at +1. It's going to be really small here. I'm going to make these little tiny so we can see. I'm going to look at the increasing sections. That would be here and here. The decreasing sections are going to be here and here. So I have 2 sections for each. Hopefully you marked those increasing sections going from this turning point of -1 to 0, and another turning point going from 1 to +infinity. So I have this little section and this section. So I have, again, -infinity to -1. And then I have that section from 0 to 1. Again, it should be continuous. So I have -infinity to -1. I have this little section right there, that little section from -1 to 0. Then I have this little section, which is 0 to 1. And then I have this section 1 to infinity. So again, no gaps all the way across a fluid line. If we were to look at it flat, we would see no gaps in those x values. All right, let me know if you have any questions, and you can get started on the homework.